Hello and welcome to the Starting Admech series, where we go from the first purchase to the first 2,000 point army list and everything in between. Finally, we have come to the 2,000 point list video. This video will be a bit different than the previous two, as we now have tournament lists to look at with real data. I have selected 4 lists to look at, each one being a bit different. But before we get into the lists, I'd like to address a potentially contentious topic. Some people may not like the idea of net listing, as they see it as stifling innovation, and while there are some cases where this is true, I think being aware of net lists is important as well. The reason being multifaceted in that it helps you understand what you may be playing against, but more importantly, by looking at lists others have made, you can avoid reinventing the wheel on certain core strategies while still innovating on top of what others have done. In other words, when viewing lists, I think it's important to first understand how they play, and then once you understand how they play, to customize them to better suit your needs and playstyle. And by doing so, you benefit from the vast knowledge collected by others while still creating innovation within the space and improving on things as you see fit. I would like to add, you may see certain similarities between these lists to some extent. However, these similarities are less about the list being competitive and more about the fact that the Admech units are not very points intensive, and as such you'll generally see a good mix of units within any given list, and that's what really leads to the similarities, as opposed to people just trying to take the best units. Because as you'll see, many of the lists are very different from one another, but they still include some level of the same units. With that being said, let's take a look at our first list. The first list is a single Mars battalion. It placed 4th in a 30-player event, and it was run by Corey Cobell. To begin, we'll look at the HQ choices. As this is a Mars battalion, the player has chosen to go with a Belisarius Call, who is great for any type of gun line, and he's given Belisarius Call a Mechanicus Locum, and this allows Call to take a Warlord trait, which has to be static SOM code. Then following Call, the list includes a Tech Priest Engine Seer, and in this case, the Tech Priest Engine Seer is the Warlord, as discussed previously in other videos, for the fact that Call cannot take a Holy Order Warlord trait, but other units can, and this is usually why Call is not the Warlord, but many times receives the Mechanicus Locum, because the static SOM code is pretty good and it helps his aura buffs. Though you always want to take advantage of the one Holy Order Warlord trait that you are given, and in this case the Engine Seer has a Divinations of the Magos, as that is usually the ability that benefits gun lines the most, as it has the Overload Safeguards option. As for the Relic, as most of our relics are rather unimpressive, the Engine Seer has an Autocadiasis of Archenland, and that's just to keep him healthy while also allowing him to heal whatever tanks he's nearby. And finally, there's a third HQ choice of a Daedalosus, which is a great unit to have in any gun line due to his Omni Scanner, and you'll oftentimes see a Daedalosus accompanying Belisarius Call. Following the HQ choice, the list includes the 3 mandatory troop choices for a battalion detachment. The first troop choice is 5 Scutari Rangers with no extra war gear, and then following the Scutari Rangers are 2 units of 5 Vanguard with no upgrades. This is a great and inexpensive way to fill up your troop choice while giving yourself some screening units and objective taking units. Now that the troop requirement is fulfilled, we can look at the elite slot. In the elite slot are 10 Fulgurite Electro Priests. As always, these guys are just great bully units that threaten objectives and any small unit squads, while also being able to hold objectives very well once they get their buffed and vulnerable save activated. As you have the 2 units of Vanguard and the Fulgurite Electro Priests, you're going to want some transports. In this case, the list includes 2 Scorpius Dune Riders. Most likely 1 Scorpius Dune Rider is for 10 Fulgurite Priests, and the other is for the 2 units of Scutari Vanguard. And this is probably why you see that split of 2 Vanguard squads and 1 Ranger squad, is because while the Vanguard have a Dune Rider to get them into position and compensate for their short range, the Rangers allow you to hang back and screen or take an objective with their extra bit of range while still shooting. So it's not always cut and dry of taking one type of troop choice or another, as there are definitely benefits to Rangers and Vanguard, though generally you're going to see Vanguard a little more often just due to the fact that they have that irradiation buff, which can come in rather handy and doesn't cost you any extra points. Moving on, we'll take a look at the fast attack choices. The fast attack choices include 5 Iron Strider Ballistaries, all equipped with autocannons. This is rather common to see in any Mars list or even any gun line, simply because the autocannons benefit so much from the different Mars buffs as well as the Mars stratagem, and can put out a ton of firepower with very little investment, to be honest. I wouldn't be surprised if we at some point saw lists running multiple squads of 5 Iron Striders, as they have so much firepower. After the Iron Striders, we have a unit of 10 Taraxi Sterilizers. The reason it is a 10-man squad most likely is because, number one, it's a fast attack choice and you only have so many slots to work with, so you have to make the best use of them. Number two, it's probably to also avoid the tax that you gain from the squad alpha because of the Taser Goad and Flechette Blaster that they have to take. And number three, there's also the ability to embark a 10-man squad on a Scorpius Dune Rider in order to give them a little bit of extra protection at this time. And to round out our fast attack choice, the list includes 5 Cerberus Raiders, and that's simply because Cerberus Raiders are great, although they're very hard on the wallet. Now that we have the fast attack slots filled out, we'll take a look at the heavy support choices. For the first heavy support choice, we have 3 Castellan robots. Each Castellan robot is armed with 3 heavy phosphor blasters. Castellan robots are one of those units that benefits a lot from being in Mars, though if you look at it, a unit of 3 of them costs 375 points, while the 5 Ballistari cost 325 points, and in many cases the Ballistari probably have the better firepower. However, that is not to say one is strictly better than the other. It is simply to compare the points cost and the firepower, illustrating the fact that maybe there is some justification for taking 2 squads of 5 Ballistari Iron Striders, for example. One thing I will mention though is that running 3 robots is rather awkward as they come in boxes of 2, so there's no real easy way of buying 3 robots. You either buy 2 or 4 for the most part, unless you have someone who's looking to sell one individual robot, though it's not the worst problem to have, as there are going to be times where you want to play 4 robots, for example. Then for the last 2 heavy support slots, the list goes with 2 Onager Dune Crawlers, each armed with an Icarus array, and in some ways this is rather surprising, because while the list includes many of the features you would see in a list which includes Belisarius Call in a Mars attachment that plays in the Sword of Castle style, you don't see any Scorpius Disintegrators within this list. Rather, they went with the Onager Dune Crawlers, and as you'll see with the second and third list, the Disintegrator is incredibly powerful, and oftentimes taken as a unit of 3, though in this case, the player chose to forgo it for either not owning it or for just because they didn't want to play it, and that just shows you that even in a list like a Mars Call Castle, there's a lot of room to take different kinds of units and play it slightly differently without necessarily being uncompetitive, and that's something that's really cool to see because I always just kind of assumed that you would take 3 Disintegrators in any Mars list because of how good they are, though here we see someone placing in 4th place without having any of them. Who knows, maybe if they had them, they would place higher, but at the same time, maybe they would have placed lower. We simply can't know if that's the case. Maybe they're onto something that we're all missing. Additionally, I'd like to point out that the Sterilizers are a little bit unique as well, because most of the time you'll see just 2 units of Cerberus Raiders versus 1 unit of Raiders and 1 unit of Sterilizers, though they are definitely powerful, and in some ways they can fulfill a similar role to the Raiders while fulfilling their own unique role as well. Now that we've seen a Mars Call Castle list, let's take a look at another popular list, being the Data Hoard Cataphron list, but as always I like to choose a list that has a little bit of spice in it that we don't see in every single Cataphron list. This list is once again a single battalion detachment, and this one actually came in 4th in a 101 player event. That's a rather large scale event, and usually you'll see Cataphron lists within tournaments simply because they're a rather resilient list to play that isn't particularly difficult to play, which is great for longer events when you're playing for 8 hours or more in a day, as at some point the more complicated lists become a little bit fatiguing in comparison to a list that just functions even if you're not playing at 100% in the last couple of rounds of the day. This list was played by a player named Philip Wolf, and for a secondary dogma he obviously chose Transnode Power Cores. Oftentimes with a Data Hoard Forge World you'll see it as a detachment paired with a second Forge World detachment, just so you can benefit from both, but in this case he's chosen to go with just 1 battalion. For the HQ choices within the battalion, he's picked up a Tech Priest Engine Seer, and he's made the Engine Seer his Warlord, giving him the Holy Order Warlord trait of Divinations of the Magos. This is actually somewhat surprising, as most of the time when you see a Data Hoard Cataphron list, they're running Learnings of the Genitor over Divinations, because Learnings gives the ability to give a lot of resilience to the Cataphrons in the Feel No Pain buff, though Divinations does have a lot of different benefits, and is generally kind of an all-around buff Holy Order Warlord trait versus Genitor, which is a little more specific, so if you find that you don't necessarily need the resilience, you can always pick up Magos as he has done in this case. For the second HQ choice, the list has a Tech Priest Manipulus. The Manipulus has the Mechanicus Locum to gain a second Warlord trait, which ends up being the Prime Hermeticon. The Prime Hermeticon is actually rather nice in a Cataphron list because it makes the Arc Claws a lot more potent in melee, keeping the Breachers from being locked down too easily, and to assist against Swarm-style units in melee, the Manipulus has an Enzion's Pseudo-Generator as his Relic. This ends up giving him a second set of Mechadendrite attacks, which he already has naturally, and this gives him a lot of ability to potentially put out a ton of damage against soft swarm units. Now, seeing as this is a Data Hoard Forge World list, and it has the Transnode Power Cores, it's obviously going to have a lot of troop choices within the Cataphron Breachers. In this case, this list has 3 units of 5 Breachers and 2 units of 3 Breachers. This is a ton of Breachers, giving you a ton of Arc Rifle shots as well as Arc Claw attacks when needed, and it's incredibly hard for your opponent to take them off the board, as they have a rather reasonable toughness, regular save, and vulnerable save. They do not have that Feel No Pain save because the Warlord trait isn't Learnings of the Genitor. Still, you have to think about it this way, that's 21 Cataphron Breachers that this list is running, and that gives you 42 heavy arc rifle shots, which are reasonably potent, as well as being on platforms that can survive a lot of firepower. After the troop choice, the list takes some fast attack slots as you'll normally see, because once again the fast attack choices are very good. For the first fast attack choice, the list takes 4 Iron Strider Ballastaris with las cannons. This kind of shows the difference between Mars Iron Striders and Iron Striders in other factions, in that many other factions prefer the las cannon on their Iron Strider for the heavy firepower, as they can't buff the strength as easily as Mars can with their autocannons. Oftentimes you'll see players running las cannons over autocannons if they're not Mars, but you'll still sometimes see autocannons in other builds, and you might even see las cannons in Mars. It all kind of depends on what the list needs. After the Iron Striders, the list takes 2 units of 4 Cerberus Raiders. Once again, the Cerberus Raiders are incredibly good for their points value, and because you're running so many Cataphrons, you don't really have any fast-moving units, so these really help you with the mobility due to their 12-inch move as well as scout move, and they allow for screening on your Iron Striders as well as your other heavy firepower units that might be hanging back and shooting versus the Cataphrons, which are moving up, though even then sometimes they can screen for the Cataphrons. For the heavy support choice, the list takes a rather safe approach, taking 3 Scorpius Disintegrators with the Belarus Energy Cannon, and as we all know, the Belarus Energy Cannon is really the only way that the Admech can avoid line of sight, so this allows the list to pick off units that might be hiding or taking shelter, such as units behind terrain that are using the terrain to block line of sight and fulfill some kind of secondary objective, or just even a primary objective that happens to fall within their range. Again, the Scorpius Disintegrator with the Belarus Energy Cannon as a whole is a rather powerful unit. Now, after the heavy support choices, this list includes something that makes it a little more interesting than a normal Cataphron list. There are 2 Archaeopters within this list, one being a Fusilier, which is the bomber, and one being the Archaeopter Stratoraptor, which is the gunship. Both these have the basic loadout with the command uplink and do not take the chaff launcher, but it's interesting to see that the player has taken 2 different types of Archaeopter, and as the Archaeopters, Disintegrators, and Iron Striders are all within the Data Hoard Forge world, they benefit from the primary dogma, gaining a little bit of extra resilience from the primary part of the dogma, which gives them a Feel No Pain. It's actually rather clever and cool, and you can see that the player does prioritize his las cannons, as well as the ability to kind of ignore line of sight with the Disintegrators, and to some extent with the bomber, as the bomber can move so quickly that it can fly over most things that are even hiding and still pivot and turn and move. As a whole, it's a bit of a different take on what a Cataphron spam list oftentimes looks like, and it's a list that features 2 different flyers, which is kind of cool. Otherwise, it's a pretty safe and standard list, though I am still surprised that the player didn't take Learnings of the Genitor, as it had so much resilience to that block of 21 Cataphrons. But then again, they did very well in a very large event, so it clearly shows that they're onto something. And as you can see, the Cataphron lists are rather small in terms of model count, so this really helps you focus on the models that you do have in play, which kind of contributes to that ease of play, as the army is not broken or just easy to play because it's so powerful. Rather, the easy to play part comes from the fact that all of your units are rather strong. However, if you're not paying attention to what you're doing, your opponent does have the ability to outplay you rather heavily due to how few units you actually have. So there is that difficulty, though that still requires your opponent to take into consideration how your army list is playing and how they're positioning a lot more than it kind of forces you to take that into consideration, which is great, especially in those later rounds when both of you are very tired and you don't have to worry as much as your opponent does. That doesn't mean that's always going to be the case, but sometimes that does play to your advantage. Now that we've taken a look at the two most popular styles of lists, being the Mars Call list and the Cataphron Data Hoard list, let's take a look at a list that's a bit different and a little more unique than the other two. This list shares a commonality with the other two as it is a battalion detachment, but unlike the previous two lists, this is a mixed detachment that features units from 3 different Forge worlds. This list placed second in a 30-player event and placed third in the same 101-player event that the second list placed within. So as I always say, there's a lot of different ways to approach an Admech army. However, one thing I would like to point out is that both events occurred before the assault drill changes. So now the assault drill is significantly more points than when this list was played. However, at the end of the list, we'll take a look at what you can do to still run the assault drill without significantly modifying how the list plays. This list was run by Ricard Nilsson, who has appeared in many different podcasts and Warhammer shows as an expert on the Admech. To begin, we'll look at the HQ choices. The first HQ choice taken is a Tech Priest Dominus from the Mars Forge world, and this Tech Priest Dominus is the Warlord, which is important because when looking at the special canicles from Engine War, you can only swap out one canicle for the same canicle as the Warlord. In this case, the player has chosen to swap out the second canicle, Litany of the Electromancer, with the Mars canicle to give heavy weapons +1 strength. This is a very common choice and it's a very powerful one. The Warlord trait for this Dominus is the Holy Order Warlord trait of Divinations of the Magos. Once again, a very standard pick. For the second HQ choice, it is a Styges 8 Tech Priest Manipulus, and the Manipulus has a basic loadout but is given a Mechanicus Locum, which takes the Prime Hermeticon Warlord trait as it allows infantry to reroll within melee, which is always a powerful ability, and especially in this list as you'll soon see. And the Relic will go on the Manipulus as well, which is Enzion Pseudo Generator. Generally, the Enzion Pseudo Generator is one of our better relics in the event that you have a character that wants to go into melee for one reason or another. And for the troop choices, once again, it's a very minimalistic troop pick with 2 units of 5 Skitarii Vanguard from the Styges 8 Forge world. And then the third troop choice is another unit of 5 Skitarii Vanguard, though in this case being from the Graia Forge world. And the reason being, the Graia Forge world allows you to use a stratagem to deny psychic powers, which can be very powerful, and the Vanguard give you a very inexpensive way of using this ability without necessarily impacting the rest of your play. And the reason you only have 1 unit of Graia Vanguard versus all 3 being Graia is probably because in some cases the other 2 units of Vanguard are embarked on a vehicle and all of the vehicles have the Styges 8 Forge world, so they have to be consistent on that end. Now, following the troop choices, there are 3 elite choices. The first elite choice is a unit of 7 Fulgurite Electro Priests, the second is a unit of 9 Fulgurite Electro Priests, and the third is a unit of 10 Fulgurite Electro Priests. That's a rather packed elite choice with the Fulgurites, and that just shows you how powerful the Fulgurites are, as you can take them in such a large quantity and they'll do a lot of work for you still. Now for the transports, in this case, there are 2 Scorpius Dune Riders and 1 Taraxi Pattern Termite Assault Drill. In this case, all of the vehicles are from the Forge World Styges 8, and the reason for this being is that the Fulgurites and the Vanguard are also from Styges 8. Most likely what you're probably going to see in terms of embarkment is that the unit of 10 goes into one of the Dune Riders, then a unit of 9 goes into another Dune Rider with the Manipulus, and finally in the Assault Drill you're probably going to see the unit of 7 with a unit of 5 Vanguard to fill up all 12 seats within the Termite Assault Drill. This potentially allows for the unit of 7 to benefit from the Vanguard debuff aura, while at the same time you can simply drop off the Vanguard on Electro Priest and have the Vanguard hold an objective while the Electro Priest move forward. And even though I'm not 100% sure if this is how the units were embarked necessarily, it shows the interesting ways you can play with unit numbers in order to embark them in creative ways. Additionally, you can always embark them in other ways to have other configurations depending on how the game is playing out. It would have been a little more interesting to see some more Graia troops just to give a little more coverage with that stratagem, though I'm sure there are plenty of reasons why the choice was made to go with only 1 unit. Now, after we've covered that, we can look at our fast attack choices. This one is actually a rather safe and standard fast attack choice selection, the first being a unit of 6 Mars Iron Strider Ballistari, once again armed with autocannons as they are from Mars, and the Mars Forge world benefits very heavily from having those have autocannons. After the Iron Striders, there are 2 units of 3 Mars Cerberus Raiders, and as always, the Cerberus Raiders are just a powerful unit. In this case, the list only has minimum squads of them. So you can see that there are very different ways of even playing this unit, where some players choose to take larger squads of them, and in some cases players take smaller squads. I've seen even larger squads allied with things like Imperial Knights, and that just shows you how powerful the unit is due to its low amount of points and strength that it brings to the table. And finally, to round out the list, we look at the heavy support, which is a rather standard 3 Scorpius Disintegrators, all from the Mars Forge world and all armed with the Belisarius energy cannon. As we saw in the second list, this is kind of the same idea, except now they benefit from the Mars Canonical, which makes them a little stronger. And as mentioned when we first started looking at this, the points no longer add up to the 1,999 points that it was, but rather to 2,043 points after the change in points on the drill. Though to resolve this, you can either drop one squad of Cerberus Raiders, which you probably don't want to do, or you can drop one of the Iron Striders, as going from 6 Iron Striders to 5 is not that big of a difference, and it will allow you to play the list without having to change the strategy significantly. So that's how I would change it if I had to, though I should mention that will drop you a little bit below your points threshold, so you might be able to pick up a little bit of extra war gear here or there. Anyway, it's a very exciting list, and it shows how you can mix different Forge worlds within one detachment, though keep in mind that when you mix Forge worlds within a single detachment, you do lose all of the dogma abilities, so you don't benefit from any of them, though you still get access to all of the stratagems, so you can use the Gra units to deny psychic powers, while using the Stygius stratagem on the different transports to move them forward at the beginning of the game, and then using things like the Wrath of Mars, as well as the Mars Canonical, and so forth on the different Mars vehicles to improve their firepower. This way you kind of get a lot of benefit from the different Forge worlds, though it does become rather command point intensive, and obviously you don't gain the benefits of the dogma, so this isn't exactly just a power gamer move, it's actually a consideration you have to make because you do give up certain things to gain other things, and it's definitely a very interesting style of play that doesn't feel broken, and it doesn't feel broken or cheesy because you give up a lot of things to gain what you do. Though don't forget, the biggest issue with this list is that you end up with a lot of bookkeeping because you do have to keep track of which units are from which Forge world. In some cases it's rather easy because you know that very specific units are from very specific Forge worlds. In other cases it becomes a little bit messier, especially if all of your Vanguard are painted the same, so sometimes you might slip up and forget where your Gra unit is, especially at the end of the day in long tournaments, though really you should be keeping track of it at all times and not really make those errors. Your opponent should also be aware of this and kind of keep an eye just to make sure you're not making any mistakes inadvertently. Now, coming to our fourth list, if you think about the first two lists as being pretty standard with a little bit of spice, and the third list having a lot more spice, and if this list was on a menu in a restaurant, it would have one of those little pepper icons next to it, due to how spicy this list is. This list is a single Lucius Brigade detachment, and it plays as an infantry swarm list. I will say this, the list has not been played in a tournament yet, but has performed well in most of the games that it has played in. This list was created by and tested by the user on Reddit known as Rook, who is the admin of the Admech subreddit, and he is planning to bring it to some large events, which will be interesting to see how it performs once those events occur. And as mentioned, it is a brigade detachment from the Lucius Forge world, and being a brigade detachment, it requires 3 HQ choices. The first HQ choice is a Tech Priest Dominus, who has the standard loadout, but he is the Warlord, so he gains a Holy Order Warlord trait, which is the divinations of the Magos. We've kind of seen that that's the one that performs the best, with Learnings of the Genitor being an option sometimes, with the other 2 Holy Order Warlord traits being very rare to find. The second HQ choice is a Tech Priest Manipulus, once again a standard set of equipment, with the Mechanicus Locum. In this case, the extra Warlord trait from the Mechanicus Locum will be the Chorustor Technus, which allows you to reroll Canicals when randomly selecting them. This is most likely to help in the event that you have to roll for a Canical and don't have command points to spend on one, in hopes of either obtaining the Lucius Special Canical, which buffs the Invulnerable save, or the Shroud Psalm Canical that helps survival as well. And the Manipulus has been given the Warlord Relic, which is the Solar Flare. And once again, if you're playing Lucius, the Solar Flare is one of the relics that's head and shoulders above most other options. And finally, for the third HQ choice, the list takes a Tech Priest Engine Seer with nothing on him. After the HQ choices, we'll take a look at the troop choices, and this is very much why the detachment is a brigade, because for the troop choices, the list runs 6 squads of 5 Vanguard with no special war gear. That's quite a lot of models to put on the table, and it only gets crazier from there. After the 6 squads of 5 Vanguard, you have 5 squads of 5 Vanguard with 2 plasma calibers each. So that brings you up to a total of 11 squads of 5 Vanguard with a total of 10 plasma calibers. That's quite a lot of firepower and quite a lot of bodies. To think about it in a different way, that is a total of 55 Vanguard models on the table, and that is an extreme amount of troops that can only really be rivaled by either an Orc Green Tide list or a Tyranid list that spams a lot of Hormigons or Termagants. So many lists are going to have a difficult time dealing with just the sheer amount of bodies. The troops aren't the only thing that make this list so interesting. As you'll see when we look at the rest of the list, it only keeps getting crazier. As for example, if we look at the elite slot, there are 3 choices, and the first elite slot is 10 Corpuscari Electropriests. The second is 5 Secutari Hoplites, which are now allowed to be in a 5-man unit after the changes. And finally, there are 5 Sicarian Ruststalkers. So while the Corpuscari Electropriests aren't uncommon in games, the Secutari Hoplites and the Sicarians have not seen much play yet, and they're not bad units, but they definitely aren't something you'll see very regularly. After talking to Rook, he did say that the Ruststalkers are great for taking objectives with their circuitous assassin ability, as well as in one game, they actually did an amazing amount of work against some heavy units with their mortal wound generation, and that's pretty cool because it shows that, hey, you can play a unit like this and perform rather well. Now, after the elites, we'll take a look at the fast attack choices. There are a total of 4 fast attack choices within this list. The first being a 5-man unit of Taraxi Sterilizers, which are a great mobile unit and can put out a lot of shots. Then there are 2 units of 5 Cerberus Raiders. Once again, the Cerberus Raiders are just good units all around, and they can do a lot of work, whether it be screening, putting out firepower, or just being very mobile around the table. And following the Cerberus Raiders, there's a unit of 9 Cerberus Sulphur Hounds. You know, the Cerberus Sulphur Hounds aren't bad units. It's usually just that they're competing with a lot of other choices within the fast attack slot. But in a list like this, they probably do a decent job of keeping up with the rest of the list. And if you're not already impressed by the sheer amount of models within this list, there's still the heavy support choice within this list. There's a total of 3 heavy support slots taken, the first being 2 Castellan robots with 3 Phosphor Blasters each, rather standard units, nothing too impressive there, followed by 2 Onager Dune Crawlers, each armed with a neutron laser and the mandatory Cognis Heavy Stubber that comes along with it. And that's a rather interesting choice, as normally I'm not the biggest fan of neutron lasers, as I much rather prefer the Icarus array. However, it does show the different ways you can arm a Dune Crawler. I might say that I might have preferred the Eradication Beamer over the neutron laser, but considering how much firepower the list already has with all of its different troops and Cerberus units and everything else, you're probably not too upset if you get a low roll with the neutron lasers, and they do offer very heavy firepower, something that you otherwise don't really have in this list. Based on my conversation with Rook, he said that the list is very hard for opponents to deal with, and in most games he had a large portion of his army still on the table while the opponents struggled to destroy units, and I can see this being the case, as right now you have to think about it this way: there are a lot of mid-range and marine lists, so a lot of people are taking units that can take out marines very well or take out other units that are rather resilient, but they're not necessarily focusing on swarm lists. So when a swarm list like this does show up with this many models, because you have to remember there's just 55 bodies alone in the troop slot, it becomes really difficult for opponents to kind of manage putting out the damage they need to wipe out all the units. And again, think about it this way: if you look at all the other lists presented here, they have way less bodies that the opponent has to deal with, especially something like the Cataphron list. Your opponent can kind of focus fire down one squad at a time versus having to split up their firepower so heavily to take out many different small squads of units. Because think about it this way, that Cataphron list has a total of something like 40 models on the table. This list here has over 100 models on the table. It's quite a difference in model count. Though that does bring us to the weakness of this list potentially, is that because you have so many models, it can become rather hard to finish games on time due to how many models you have to move within a turn, and any amount of slow play can really hamper your ability to complete a game. Considering that a lot of your victory points are scored at the end of the game and determine how your overall performance is done within a tournament, it can become rather difficult for you to kind of optimize your points within a tournament. Though with enough practice and playing this list, you'll probably gain the ability to work around that limitation, though it is something to consider because sometimes you'll be struggling to take your turn efficiently. You also have to remember that when you're playing against your opponent with this list, you do want to be respectful of your opponent as well, because you don't want to create a situation where your opponent doesn't have enough time to play a game because of how many units you're running. Still though, if you enjoy a sort of troop-heavy army list, this is one that's very interesting, and from what I heard, it has done well in many of its games, and that's not necessarily surprising because we have seen lists like the Tyranid Hormagon Termagon spam, as well as Green Tide lists that have employed similar strategies in order to gain an advantage. It's a little harder with the Admech, but as you can see here, it is doable and it can be successful. And with that being said, that is the conclusion of this series, as we've completed our look at 2,000 point army lists within the series itself. However, there's plenty of content still to come out for both the Admech and other armies, and if you've enjoyed the content, please subscribe, like, and share, as there's plenty more to come, and that really does help the channel grow. Anyway, thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.